Good morning, friends. As we close out the week, let's set the stuff directly concerning Satan and the demons aside and remind ourselves of the basic point of our Lord's illustration in Matthew chapter 12, verses 43 to 45. He describes a man who has a demon. The demon leaves. The man gets his life in order, but he's still empty because he's not submitted himself to God and so received the Spirit of God. And so when the demonic spirit returns, that man's last state is far worse than what it was at first. Because when we make external reforms without imagining internal change, as the illustration indicates, that's like cleaning out a house, setting it in order, but still leaving it empty for the enemy to take easy possession of it. Because we're not saved by those external reforms. And those external reforms, getting your life in order, so to speak, is not what prevents the enemy from coming back in and taking over again. We talked on Sunday about the Pharisees rising to prominence in the generations prior to our Lord's incarnation and how they truly had reformed the nation of Israel in a similarly external way. The outward idolatry that seemed so prevalent beforehand had gone away. The people, at least in an outward fashion, under the strict gaze of the Pharisees, were paying much more attention to the law, at least as the Pharisees taught it. But as I also mentioned Sunday, the Pharisees had stripped the heart of the gospel out of their teaching. They did not focus, as they should have, on the grace and mercy of God. And because some people don't realize it, and for lots of various reasons, that is almost like the Pharisees' teaching being perpetuated even to our own day. And for that reason, they don't realize that the grace and mercy of God is incredibly evident and ever present throughout the Old Testament. It was absolutely clear enough, even in the law, so as to lead people to understand that the only way of true salvation was to rely on the mercy of God and forgiveness, to trust in His righteousness and His promise rather than one's own efforts. As such, the Pharisees performed significant reforms throughout Israel, but they were still empty. The people did not have actual faith in God for salvation from sin. Indeed, they weren't even looking for salvation from sin. The salvation they had in mind was merely physical, temporal, and earthly. And when Jesus came, offering salvation, offering rest, offering the filling of God with abundant life, they rejected Him. And which leads to another occasion in Matthew, I believe, chapter 15, Jesus would then quote Isaiah 29:13, applying what Isaiah said, or what God said through Isaiah of that day to the nation of Israel in His own day. And so He says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." So as we've kind of talked about, instead of teaching the actual law of God, they taught their own perverted version, full of their own rules, and in their application of it, distorting the actual law of God. And this is why, again, they were empty. They were just teaching the commandments of men rather than the actual teaching of God that would lead people to God. And here's the thing, and something I really want us to consider this morning. As a result of all this, Jesus says, "In vain do they worship me." In other words, the people are attempting to worship God. They are, in many ways, I believe, convinced that they actually are worshiping God. Their intent is to worship. And yet Jesus says they're doing it in vain. Which, again, funnily enough, we have to remind ourselves, what is the basic meaning of the word vain? Is it not to be empty, to be worthless and futile in that way? So their worship is empty and therefore worthless and invalid because they are not actually worshiping God according to the truth, because they do not have God within themselves. They are not filled with His Spirit. And that is something that we need to keep in mind, both for our own worship as well as guarding the church as a whole in her worship. Because there are so many people in churches all around who say that God only cares about the sincerity of your heart, that we can worship Him in many different, various ways that are chosen because they're personally meaningful to us, because they're ways that really, we really connect with, or that we really happen to enjoy. But friends, if those ways don't also line up with the truth, and how he commands and instructs us to worship, then we can be as sincere as possible, and we can worship in ways that we find incredibly enjoyable, so that we come out of those experiences with smiles on our faces and feeling so uplifted because of the emotional experience. And yet, if they are not in line with God's truth, Jesus still says that such worship is in vain, because people can be sincere in that way, and yet Christ's words would still apply. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Because again, sincerity is not what makes our worship acceptable. Now, of course, we ought to be sincere in our worship, but sincere in our submission to the truth, that we worship God as the holy God, the sovereign God, the one who is high and lifted up. We worship the God that is, and we do so in humble recognition that we are not. So as we continue to process our Lord's teaching from this past week, and we prepare to hear his word again this coming Sunday, let's examine our hearts and our minds and our actions. Do we honor him with our lips? If so, good. We should be honoring him with our lips. But does what is in our hearts match that external expression? Are those honoring words that come across our lips true reflections of what is inside, in terms of wanting to worship God full of his Spirit in truth? Or are the hypocritical words born of a hypocritical heart that truly only wants to do its own thing, which is to deny God's truth and go after your own truth, which is essentially a lie? So let's seriously and genuinely examine ourselves. And if we find that our desire truly is to worship God and glorify him according to the truth, then let's enter into corporate worship together with just that much more joy and vigor to lift up and magnify his holy name. I love you guys. Have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I will see you this coming Lord's Day.